The Frick is one of the finest art museums in the world, period. And what distinguishes it is this extraordinary balance of the quality of both the collection of art and the house, and the sense of its personality. It's the character that draws people in. You do feel as if you're a guest, and we could not lose that. That's who we are.
The main priority was to preserve what is special about the Frick. So nothing about this renovation and enhancement project was meant to change one's relationship to the art objects. And that is, every encounter should be one of discovery and contemplation and directness.
So the balance is, how do you continue to retain that sense of intimacy while you introduce all the new amenities and systems and services that are required in a 21st century museum?
It's a very difficult task, right? Provide everything that we want to give to our visitors without disrupting or disturbing any of what we value about the Frick. And I think that that's unique. Not too many projects go to an architect and say, hey, give us this whole new program, but actually don't change anything. Give us all this and do no harm.
The pleasure of this project was not only being able to add important new spaces that we've needed, but to refurbish the existing historic ones. But also, the Frick has spent 90 years continuing this goal to add what it needed. So what did it need? It needed more space for the art. It needed a better exhibition space. We never had a single classroom. Our auditorium was so small, we were always turning people away. Our conservation department used to be in a servant's room on the 3rd floor with no running water. The skylights were broken, leaking. Our heating and air conditioning systems were on their last legs. Our electrical systems hadn't been updated since 1935. All of these things had to be addressed.
This is really one of New York's, one of the country's finest buildings.
It's one of the last Gilded Age mansions. And so just in and of itself, that makes it unique and an important historic structure within New York City.
And it sits on some of the most special real estate in the world, on Fifth Avenue between 70th and 71st Street.
It was very important for all of us to understand what the trajectory and impetus of the different architects and the different eras in and around the building were, because it affected how we built.
A lot of people experience the Frick as a single building, but it's really a series of buildings that have been shaped over a very specific amount of time.
The original building was constructed as a residence for Henry Clay Frick by Thomas Hastings of Carrera and Hastings of New York Public Library fame, and that really set the stage. Beaux-Arts architecture, classic proportions, intermixed with these beautiful gardens.
Here in 1914, Thomas Hastings did something really dramatic. The main portion of the mansion is set back from Fifth Avenue. That was even in 1914 a kind of radical and extreme thing to do, showing off that you can afford a garden even though you have Central Park right in front of you.
The question of whether the house was built for the collection or vice versa is an interesting one. And the answer is a little bit of both. The mansion was finished in 1914. Frick sadly only lived here 5 years. He died in 1919. His wife Adelaide passed in 1931. The trustees then put Frick's will into place, which was to turn this private house into a public institution. And they decided the original house wasn't big enough.
Fast forward to 1935, when John Russell Pope was the selected architect to convert the mansion into a museum.
They invited Pope to double the spaces, and there are many spaces downstairs, the Oval Room, the East Gallery, which were an expansion. It wasn't part of the original house.
Originally, there was a kind of porte cochere, which allowed vehicles to get from 70th Street drop visitors off in the mansion, and then go through to come out on 71st Street. Pope actually filled that which was the porte cochere, now the garden court.
At the same time, the 1924 library was demolished, and Pope did the 9-story Frick Art Research Library that we know now.
So the Frick opens to the public in 1935, and what's really telling is that 5 years later, in 1940, it starts buying nearby townhouses. In other words, already within 5 years of opening, it realizes it needs more space.
In 1977, they took those buildings down and they created a new reception hall. That was the depth of the recession. They didn't have the resources to do a large addition at that time. And so they didn't want these adjacent sites to be unattractive, and they decided to put a garden there. So they hired Russell Page to create that garden. And they also had the architects, Bailey, Van Dyke, and Poehler, create these garden walls. So this entire area, the reception hall, the garden walls, and the garden itself were all built in 1977. There really hasn't been any other significant building construction since that time.
I'm going to get a sharp pencil so that I can defend myself if I have to. We knew that renovating, restoring, expanding the Frick would, if nothing else, call for skepticism.
This is my second project at the Frick. The first one failed, to be frank. The first one was to be built on the 70th Street Garden, which was the Frick's intention since its very first architectural plan of 1966. Made sense to me when I arrived, but the garden is a beautiful garden. It had many fans, and there were objections to our using that as the site for the building. So we had to withdraw that plan. And to give my trustees and staff credit, we all pulled together again. We came up with a new plan. We listened to many of the criticisms of the earlier plan, and instead made the garden kind of the centerpiece, in a way, of everything we've done.
First, we did a very in-depth conditions assessment of the building, looking at the physical condition of the historic fabric. We went in and created a three-dimensional model of the existing building. Then we did the preservation plan, and we assigned differing degrees of significance, where the most significant spaces should be restored and should have the lightest touch possible.
We haven't added a lot of square footage to the building. The Selldorf project really relies on creating connections and links between the spaces. And I think it does that in a very seamless, elegant way.
We're raising the roof of the single-story reception hall, making it possible to have a second floor, and that second floor connect to the old mansion. We're adding in this area a 3-story addition over the existing ground floor, a volume that serves for conservation for staff over what's now the temporary galleries on the ground floor, and the addition to the rear of the library. In other words, the library gets added onto itself in the rear yard. Rather than making it one long facade, we divided it into two and connect the two through this bridge element, which communicates transparency and continuity. So, utilizing the original footprint, we were able to give the reception hall on the ground floor more widths, and with a new stair and 2 new elevators connect both upwards to the second floor as well as downstairs to where there is a new auditorium below the Russell Page Garden. And that new auditorium, for me, is a really very exciting thing because it's a newly conceived space, but is really based on the idea that we were able to use found space. The Russell Page Garden, of course, is actually a roof garden because it sits atop the basements of 3 adjacent townhouses that were to the east of the original Frick.
So the structure that was built in 1941 was completely below grade. This was the art vault, which was always the deepest part of the excavation. Because of World War II, there was actually the thought that New York City might be bombed, which is why they wanted to create this vault to hold all of the art in the entire collection. So this is what we had previously, and this is the now built condition of our project. So you can see we had a lot of underground space.
So we were able to make use of space that already exists and insert a new auditorium for 220 people.
But what was not working well here for us is this reception hall, which was built in '77. They only built this upper volume. And so you can see the line of this exterior wall, if you follow this down, this is not actually sitting on the foundations. We could not expand and build on top of this reception hall. There wasn't the foundation capacity because this is actually a cantilever. So we had to actually dig down and create a proper foundation for this building. But in order to change the foundation, we had to put up a major support right in here for much of the construction. So literally they brought in 4-foot beams, supported this whole structure all the way across, and then came in with little diggers to get in there and do that work.
So we removed the entire garden, removed these existing foundations. We held this building up and built a structural wall, which you see is now in this spot. We expanded the volume for the auditorium, and then we created new structure for the garden, slabbed it over, created new waterproofing, created the pond, and replanted the garden.
Based on that, we had this great opportunity to go back and restore the garden to be much truer to the original design intent. Working with the Frick's archivists, who had a great wealth of photographs and drawings that Russell Page did himself and correspondence, we were able to, working with Lyndon Miller, the well-known garden designer, redesign the garden so it's much truer to its original design than it's been for many decades.
In many ways, the core of this project has been to open the second floor.
We used to have a rope that would block access to the grand staircase going up to the second floor because for the last 90 years, those were private offices. Now, about 10 rooms and a few passages on the second floor have been opened and reinstalled as gallery spaces for art.
Henry Clay Frick himself, and certainly the Frick as an institution, has always had a feeling that they're part of history, and it's important to save things. One of the most valuable resources to us as we were trying to develop these second floor galleries were these 1927 archival photos, which were taken by the Frick before they started the 1935 construction. And I think that those photos were amazing guidance for us. We looked at them constantly for everything from light fixtures to flooring to how a wall configuration may or may not have changed. And I think our former head curator, Xavier Salomon, was quite clear about this, that if there was a historical condition that we could reasonably return to architecturally, that we should do that. This wasn't about creating period rooms where we did not have them. This was about being true to kind of the scale, the proportions, the flow, the circulation, the connection between spaces. And that being important to the way the house was occupied and lived in, and wanting to be able to offer that as part of the experience of this building.
There are certain spaces on the second floor that are very much as they were when the Frick family lived here, especially the breakfast room. That's almost exactly as it was.
This was the bedroom of Henry Clay Frick. And in this room, we have kind of brought to life some of the things that he loved the most, which is portraits, and especially George Romney's portrait of Emma Hamilton. That's also where Frick had it when he lived here. And so it has this pride of place, and it's something that we were very happy to reinstate. This room used to be a guest room and a very private one, so you couldn't actually access it from the hallway. You had to come through this larger sitting room that we were just in. Since 1935, it was an office. And then once we decided to open this room to the public, this is a space devoted to the Schur collection of metals. And so these cases have been at enormous precision and environmental care for the objects inside, installed so that a maximum number of objects could be shown at an optimal presentation. The other interesting thing in terms of those who know the collection very well is the Boucher room was able to move back to its original location at the corner of the house as Mrs. Frick's boudoir. which reinstates its place as a very private, intimate space that you access through a series of small corridors.
This was the director's office from 1935 until now. My desk was right over in the corner. But as you see, it was originally a totally different room. We're surrounded by paintings by the French 18th century artist François Boucher and French 18th century decorative arts. And when the Frick opened to the public in 1935, the second floor was off limits. So this room was moved downstairs. So this is simply one example where we were able to bring this back so the public can understand how this second floor functioned. One of the spaces that's of great personal interest to me is the Education Center. So the Education Department, which existed for some 30 years, had no classrooms. They did what they could, but they needed their own space. So I made the decision to move the shop up to the second floor, where I think with the cafe is a very successful endpoint. And it gave us this wonderful sense of space downstairs.
Today, we're going to use a selection of very iconic works from the collection for inspiration for a session of drawing. The Ian Wardropper Education Room occupies a really critical space in that it is really well connected to other parts of the building, certainly the galleries. It's a multi-purpose space in which we can use it not just as a classroom, but also a space for more intimate lectures, symposia, art making. It has an absolutely stunning view of the garden that also signals to people who are participants, whether it be students or adults, educators, that you are having an elevated experience.
The other space that I'm personally very attached to is our Conservation Center. It's a truly state-of-the-art space, 5 times larger than what they had before.
Well, perhaps I should start by describing our previous conservation studio, which was a 350 square foot room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. There were a number of the objects that wouldn't make it to the lab. There was no way to get them there. In fact, a colleague of mine worked in the reception hall in a plywood box for about 9 months, treating the life-size sculpture of Diana the Huntress because there was no other place for her to work. So we have the equipment we need now to really treat this collection with the care it deserves.
Another thing that makes the Frick very special is the idea of quality. When we looked at the restoration of this building, it had to really attain the same level of quality that Henry Clay Frick always had in the original design.
So, for example, all the silk damask and velvets that were originally covering the walls downstairs, we were able to go back to Lyon in France, where the original factories had the original loom patterns and we could reweave them. So they are of the original quality, they are lustrous and shining. We've been able to conserve and refurbish all the stone, the plaster, the woodwork. And so everything's been brought back to its glory.
We worked with the artisans making the passementerie, the silk borders based in Paris. Our display cases were made in Frankfurt, Germany. We worked with a carver in Brooklyn on reproducing the missing panels in the Boucher room. We worked with a team from Chelsea that specializes in moving period rooms. So we went wherever we found the craft skills that we needed.
We work with several lighting designers, and they all had different responsibilities because there are many different types of lighting in a museum. The picture lights, for example. And you see each one of these has a little lamp with LED bulbs coming down. Every single picture that has a picture light was evaluated, tweaked multiple times because each work of art actually requires a little bit of a different treatment in order for them all to seem like a unified and cohesive paintings collection in total.
And there's some absolutely beautiful chandeliers, which have the typical types of candelabra-type lights, but then really discrete little pin spots that would either help illuminate part of the exhibit or be indirect lights off the ceiling. Another challenge on the project was to replace the 3 major skylights that are over the galleries and the garden court. which could only be done with technology that's been developed in the last decade. This created a sea change difference in terms of how those spaces and the artwork in those spaces is experienced.
We had a consultant on glare, we had a daylight consultant. So we really worked hard to make sure these paintings were properly illuminated. It's interesting, in some of the opening events, I had visitors who were seeing it for the first time actually ask me, and I got this question repeatedly, did you clean every painting in the collection? Which was not at all the case. It's really a matter of how the lighting changed the look of things.
I think the important thing is that through this massive renovation, a 5-year closure, and truly a complete overhaul of some of the systems that people can't even see, we are able to do what we were doing better, with more space, with better amenities for visitors in the 21st century, being able to fulfill some of the mission a little bit differently too.
At the end of the day, it's seamless, and you kind of scratch your head and think, didn't this always exist?
This is one of the rare old master institutions. We need to give it all of the resources and the power that it needs to flourish in the future.
Essentially, one of the things that we did with this project is prepare the building for the next 100 years.
Probably the main negative criticism we get, which is so funny, is that, well, the Frick hasn't changed at all, which is great because we've actually changed a lot. But if we can project the experience for people that this is a place it's always been, but it's brand new, that is an achievement for us.